This is Living Power with Dan Hurst.
That's the mentality that we tend to follow. And so to them, that made perfect sense. And it was a good solution, if you ask me. But it wasn't what God wanted to do. Jesus said, look, there's something different here. There's a different basis for the solution. And it's found in verse 16. And when it says, Jesus answered, or Jesus said. You know, you can put a period after that because that's the answer. The answer, the solution is, Jesus said. This is what God said. The truth of the matter is, if we would spend more time seeking God's directive, even in His Word, we would find our way out of more crisis and more difficulties in our lives. Those principles are given to us in the Word of God, and that's what we're looking at right now. But the solution began with Jesus said, the basis for the solution. It always is, it always will be. Jesus answered, Jesus replied, they don't need to go away, you give them something to eat. That must have sounded very, very strange to the disciples. Oh yeah, we don't have any food, Jesus. I don't know if you've been listening. It's late and there is no food. And they would have rolled their eyes, like we do. It was an obvious contradiction to the disciples' solution. The disciples were thinking, man, we thought this through and we know what needs to be done. We'll take care of it, Jesus. We'll send them away. And Jesus says, no, give them some food. You're not listening. Isn't it interesting how different God's perspective is than ours? God doesn't follow the running water solution. He doesn't follow that way of thinking. That doesn't make sense to God. It's not the answer. Jesus' solution was, you give them something to eat. If the people are hungry, you give them something to eat. Now notice I'm jumping ahead of the problem, jumping ahead of the situation here, but Jesus did send them away. He did say, okay, yeah, you're right, it's the end of the day, it's about to get dark, let's send them away. But that wasn't the only solution. The solution was He wanted to give them something to eat also. He was obviously a Baptist. And it was important for Him to take care of this situation, this need in their life. And so Jesus says, you give them something to eat. Now on the surface, it appears completely irrational and totally undoable. Impossible. There's no food. How do you do this? But Jesus was looking at a bigger picture than we do. He was looking at the solution while the disciples were looking at the problem. That's what's happening in verse 17. The disciples say, look, Jesus, you don't understand the situation. All we've got are 5 loaves of bread, which were little buns, by the way. They weren't loaves. They were little buns of bread, and 2 fish, which were sardines, which is disgusting to start with. And so that's all they've got. They've got these 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and that's it. You don't understand the problem, God. Have you ever said that to God? You have when you said, God, I'm going to take care of the solution here. Because anytime you decide that you're going to solve the crisis or solve the problem, instead of letting God do it, you've said, God, you don't understand the situation. You don't know what's going on. We have only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. What they saw as the problem, Jesus saw as the solution. That's an amazing thing that God does. What they saw as the problem, we've only got 5 pieces of bread and 2 little sardines, and we've got about 15,000 people here, God. Jesus says, you give them something to eat, was not a taunt. Jesus wasn't teasing them. He was giving them instruction. He was giving them responsibility to feed the people, to meet their needs. Now listen, alone, they did not have what was needed to accomplish the task. They couldn't do it. There was no way they were going to be able to accomplish this task. But that wasn't a problem for Jesus. What was a problem for them was not a problem for God. God knew what the solution was. He instructed them then to bring to Him what they did have. Because the problem as they saw it was actually the solution for God. And He says, bring him here, and He directed the people to sit down on the grass, and they took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and He looked up to heaven, and He And he gave thanks, and he broke the loaves, and he gave to the disciples, and the disciples gave to the people. And it was this process of multiplication, and it just began to spread. He kept breaking the bread and giving it, and breaking the bread and giving it. And it was just like, it was this amazing miracle how it just began to grow exponentially. But what was happening here was something that Jesus was teaching to the disciples, but also teaching to us, and it was this. The responsibility was theirs to feed the people, but the means to do so was Jesus' responsibility. And this is so important for us to understand because we confuse the two. We tend to think that we have the responsibility and we have to come up with the means. You see, if First Baptist Church of Raytown or any other First Baptist church or any other Methodist church or Presbyterian church or any other church in America or in the world for that matter would have been in charge of this situation, first of all, we would have called a committee meeting and probably had a knockdown, drag-out business meeting on how to do it. And we would have had this whole process of coming up with a plan of how to come up with the means. Oh, we're willing to accept the fact that we have responsibility. We know that Jesus said, go, and as you go, make disciples and teach them, and that we're up to go out and touch the world and change the world and meet needs and win the lost. We know all of that. We know we have the responsibility. What we don't know about is the means. And so we've got to get a financial committee together to come up with the means. We've got to get a budget together to come up with the means. Because we're all focused on, well, how are we going to do it, God? You know, we've got the responsibility, so we confuse responsibility with the means. But Jesus made it very clear here, the responsibility was theirs to feed the people. The means to do so was his responsibility. You've heard me say this over and over and over and over again. God's will done God's way never lacks for God's provision. And this is proof of that. God's will, done God's way, never lacks for God's provision. And when we learn that amazing truth, it will change our ministry. It will change the way that we do business. It will change the way we walk through life. Recognizing I have responsibility, but God is responsible for the means. You don't have the means to accomplish the ministry that God has directed you to accomplish. Did you know that? Have you figured that out? You don't have the means to accomplish the ministry that God has called you to. Even if you have a nice big bank account and God's told you to go do something, trust me, your bank account isn't big enough. You don't have the means to accomplish the ministry that God's called you to. You know why? Because God has called you to an impossible ministry. We are in the ministry of the impossible. That's what God has called us to do. And the more impossible the situation, the greater the demand for God's means. And I look at the world today, and I was talking to another pastor about this a couple of weeks ago, and we're talking about, man, it's just harder now than it's ever been, to minister to people and to talk to people about Christ. People are just so cold and distant, and the ministry's tougher now. And I agree with it because that's what you do. And but really what the Word of God says is that it's not about how difficult it is, because it's not too difficult for God. It is the ministry of the impossible. That's what God has called us to, the ministry of the impossible. We don't have the means to accomplish what God's called us to do, but He does. We have the ministry of the impossible, and once we recognize that, once we recognize what our ministry is, our responsibility, then what we do is we begin to look for God to provide the means and let Him direct where He wants us to go. And one of the things that I've discovered is that you just go with what God gives. Sometimes we see the problem is so incredibly huge. It's so big that God doesn't want us to focus on how big the problem is. Sometimes He just wants us to focus on this small little part. That's all we need to be focused on right now.